You awaken to the sharp sound of steel being honed in the pre-dawn gloom of the London Tower. It is May 19th, 1536. The rhythmic scrape of whetstone against the bare blade slices through the morning mists like a stark knell. Each stroke is precise, unhurried, conclusive. You are England's former queen, and in less than 4 hours, that very blade will cleave your head from your shoulders. The ancient stone walls of your small cell seem to throb with your own quickened pulse as you perch on the edge of your narrow bed. Your hands tremble, not from the chill, but from the crushing burden of knowing what awaits. Beyond your grated window, you discern the loud thud of carpenters' hammers constructing the rough scaffold that will serve as the grim stage for your final public display. Each jarring blow echoes deep within your bones, a stark countdown to oblivion that has been steadily building for endless weeks. Your ladies-in-waiting drift silently around the chamber like pale wraiths, their faces drawn and colorless. They dress you in a gown of dark gray damask, a white chemise peeking beneath, hues of sorrow and purity. You wonder with bitter irony which now truly applies to you, and note Henry's deliberate choice. Even in your death, he seeks to control the narrative, to costume you as the repentant sinner rather than the innocent victim. The air inside the tower carries the familiar scent of river mud and human despair. But this morning, it is laced with something new, the stark, metallic tang of fear and the faint, sweet smoke of frankincense from the nearby chapel, where prayers are being offered for your soul. You can faintly hear the murmur of distant voices beyond your guarded door, the soft shuffle of feet, the faint clink of armor as guards take their assigned positions. The machinery of execution is already in relentless motion, and you are merely the central figure in this meticulously choreographed horror. The nightmare that would culminate in Anne's execution began not with charges of treason or adultery, but with King Henry VIII's desperate yearning for a male heir and his escalating fixation on Jane Seymour. By January 1536, and had endured yet another miscarriage. This one proved particularly devastating. As it happened on the same day, Henry suffered a severe jousting accident, leaving him unconscious for 2 hours. The powerful symbolism was lost on no one at court. As the king lay near death, so too did Anne's hopes of securing her precarious position through childbirth. The miscarried child was reported to be male, a detail that would tragically haunt Anne's final months. Henry, who had severed ties with Rome and plunged England into turmoil to marry her, began to whisper that their very union was divinely cursed. The identical theological arguments he had wielded to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon were now being cruelly turned against Anne. The irony was exquisite in its brutality. The very justifications that had elevated her to queenly status would now irrevocably destroy her. But Henry needed more than mere divine displeasure to rid himself of Anne. He required irrefutable legal grounds that would not cast doubt upon his own judgment or the legitimacy of their young daughter, Elizabeth. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, a man whose survival depended entirely on anticipating the king's every unspoken wish, began to meticulously construct a case so elaborate and damning that it would not only destroy but utterly obliterate any lingering sympathy for her. The first crucial thread Cromwell pulled concerned Anne's relationship with the court musician, Mark Smeaton. Smeaton was everything Henry was not: young, lively, dark-haired, and possessed of an easy charm that made him popular among the court ladies. On April 30th, 1536, Cromwell had Smeaton arrested and taken to his house in Stepney, where the young man was subjected to an interrogation that almost certainly included torture, though no official record survived detailing the specific methods used. What is certain is that Smeaton, who had initially denied any improper relationship with the Queen, emerged from Cromwell's intense questioning prepared to confess not merely to adultery with Anne, but to specific, damning details that would form the very backbone of the case against her. The precise timing and nature of his confession strongly suggest a man broken by unimaginable pain and terror, willing to utter anything to make the agony cease. With Smeaton's coerced confession in hand, Cromwell swiftly moved to weave a sinister web of alleged conspirators. Henry Norris, the king's groom of the stool and one of his closest confidants, was arrested on May 1st during the festive May Day celebrations at Greenwich Palace. The chilling irony of arresting Norris during a festival of spring and renewal was keenly felt by all. It was as if Cromwell deliberately sought to poison every symbol of joy and celebration. Norris had served Henry for over a decade, a trusted companion with access to the king's most private moments. His alleged crime was not simply adultery with the queen, but treason of the highest order, the ultimate betrayal of the man who had elevated him from minor nobility to a position of tremendous power and influence. Under interrogation, Norris steadfastly maintained his innocence, a resolve that spoke either to his genuine virtue or his grim awareness that a confession meant certain death. William Brereton followed Norris to the Tower on May 4th. Brereton was a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, a man whose Welsh origins and relatively modest background rendered him dependent on royal favor for his court position. Like Norris, he was accused of adultery with the queen. But Cromwell added an additional, more insidious layer to Brereton's alleged crimes: conspiracy to murder the king so that it might marry one of her lovers and rule through a puppet husband. The most shocking arrest came on May 5th when Sir Francis Weston, barely 25 years old and recently married, was also taken to the Tower. Weston hailed from a wealthy family and had no apparent need to risk everything for the queen's favor, which made his inclusion in the conspiracy particularly perplexing to contemporary observers. His youth and the fact that he ostensibly had everything to live for made his alleged participation in such a dangerous plot seem almost impossible to believe. But it was the final arrest that sent shockwaves through the entire court and fully revealed the true depth of Henry's cruelty. On May 2nd, George Boleyn, his younger brother and Viscount Rochford, was arrested on monstrous charges of incest with his own sister. The accusation was so utterly beyond the pale of acceptable behavior, even within the morally flexible Tudor court, that it served a very specific, calculated purpose. It branded and not merely as an adulteress, but as a creature so depraved that no punishment could be deemed too severe. George Boleyn was everything his sister was: intelligent, cultured, and possessed of a sharp wit that had made him both popular and, ultimately, dangerous at court. He was also fiercely loyal to, and a loyalty that Henry perceived as a direct threat to his own absolute authority. By charging George with incest, Cromwell wasn't merely destroying Anne's brother. He was ensuring that no one would dare speak in her defense, lest they be seen as implicitly supporting such an unnatural and abhorrent crime. The astonishing speed with which these arrests occurred, all within a mere 5 days, starkly reveals the meticulously orchestrated nature of the conspiracy against Anne. This was not a gradual discovery of wrongdoing, but a precisely timed demolition designed to deny Anne's allies any opportunity to organize a defense or even fully grasp the terrifying reality unfolding around them. Anne herself was arrested on May 2nd, immediately after returning from watching a tennis match at Greenwich Palace, where she had observed Henry playing with Francis Weston, the very man who would be arrested 3 days later as her alleged lover. The symbolism was chillingly deliberate and cruel. Anne's last moments of freedom were spent watching the king enjoy himself with the very man who would be accused of betraying him. The charges against Anne were read to her by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, a man who owed his elevated position partly to the Boleyn family's ascent, but who now found himself in the grim position of pronouncing her doom. Norfolk's participation in Anne's destruction vividly illustrated the brutal calculus of Tudor politics. Family loyalty meant absolutely nothing when weighed against royal favor and personal survival. Anne's initial reaction to the charges was recorded by several witnesses, and their accounts paint a picture of a woman grappling with the sheer magnitude of what was happening to her. She reportedly laughed when informed of the adultery charges, not from amusement, but from the sheer, monstrous absurdity of the accusations. The notion that she could have conducted multiple illicit affairs under the intense scrutiny of court life where her every movement was meticulously watched and recorded, was so preposterous that laughter seemed the only sane response. But as the full scope of the charges became agonizingly clear, adultery with 5 men, incest with her brother, conspiracy to murder the king, and plotting to marry one of her lovers after Henry's death, Anne's laughter died in her throat. She was being accused not merely of sexual impropriety, but of treason so comprehensive that it touched every aspect of her relationship with the crown and court. The journey from Greenwich Palace to the Tower of London took, and through the very same streets where she had ridden in triumph during her coronation procession just 3 short years earlier. Then, crowds had cheered and scattered flowers. Now, they watched in sullen, terrified silence as the fallen queen passed by in a barge, surrounded by grim guards. The contrast must have been almost unbearable, to travel the exact route that had once symbolized the pinnacle of her ambitions, now bound for a fortress from which few emerged alive. Upon her arrival at the Tower, Anne was housed in the identical apartments she had occupied before her coronation, another deliberate cruelty that forced her to confront the dizzying height from which she had fallen. The rooms that had once been meticulously prepared for a triumphant queen were now a luxurious prison, complete with the same tapestries and furnishings that had borne witness to her greatest moment of glory. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, was explicitly instructed to keep detailed records of Anne's every word and behavior during her imprisonment. Kingston was a career administrator, a man who understood that his own survival depended on providing his superiors with precisely the information they desired to hear. His reports depict Anne as alternately defiant and despairing, sometimes maintaining her innocence with regal dignity, other times breaking down completely under the crushing weight of her circumstances. One of the most revealing aspects of Kingston's reports is Anne's apparent inability to truly believe that Henry would actually have her executed. She repeatedly expressed confidence that the king would ultimately show mercy, that their shared marriage and intertwined history would count for something in the final, brutal calculation. This clinging faith in Henry's essential humanity reveals either Anne's fundamental misunderstanding of the man she had married or her psychological inability to fully accept the horrifying reality of her situation. The trial of Anne's alleged co-conspirators commenced on May 12, 1536, in Westminster Hall. The proceedings were a masterclass in calculated judicial theater, designed not to determine actual guilt or innocence, but to provide a flimsy veneer of legal legitimacy to what was, in essence, a political execution. The evidence against the men was overwhelmingly circumstantial. Gifts Anne had bestowed upon them, seemingly innocent conversations they had shared, and their mere presence at court events where opportunities for misconduct allegedly arose. Mark Smeaton's tortured confession remained the tenuous cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Yet even this was highly problematic. Smeaton was a musician of modest birth, utterly dependent on royal favor for his position. The notion that he would risk everything for an affair with the Queen stretched credibility to its breaking point, particularly given the extreme punishment such a relationship would inevitably entail. Nevertheless, his confession, brutally extracted under circumstances that likely involved torture, provided the fragile foundation upon which the entire fabricated conspiracy rested. Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston all steadfastly maintained their innocence throughout their trials, refusing to confess, even when offered the tantalizing possibility of commuted sentences in exchange for admissions of guilt. Their unwavering resolve in the face of certain death strongly suggests either remarkable courage or genuine innocence, or perhaps a potent combination of both. These were men who had everything to live for and nothing whatsoever to gain from protecting a queen who was clearly doomed. The trial of George Boleyn, conducted separately due to his noble rank, was perhaps the most dramatic of all. George was an accomplished orator and a sharp legal mind who chose to defend himself against the spurious charges. His powerful performance in Westminster Hall was so compelling that observers noted the jury seemed genuinely moved by his arguments and appeared genuinely uncertain about his guilt. For a brief, fleeting moment, It seemed that at least one of Anne's alleged conspirators might actually escape the meticulously woven net Cromwell had cast. But George made a fatal error, one that revealed either his profound naivety about cutthroat court politics or his desperate, noble desire to clear his beloved sister's name. When presented with a written question that he was explicitly instructed only to read silently, George instead read it aloud, his voice ringing clearly throughout the entire court. The question concerned Henry's alleged impotence and his rumored inability to satisfy and sexually. Information so profoundly damaging to the king's public reputation that it sealed George's fate, regardless of his actual guilt or innocence. The verdicts in all the trials were, inevitably, foregone conclusions. Norris, Weston, Brereton, and Smeaton were all found guilty and sentenced to the traditional punishment for treason, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. George Boleyn, by virtue of his noble birth, was sentenced to death by beheading. The astonishing speed of the trials and the chilling uniformity of the verdicts made it abundantly clear that these proceedings were driven by raw political necessity, not impartial justice. Henry's treatment of the condemned men revealed the calculating cruelty that characterized his entire handling of the affair. He commuted the sentences of the four commoners to simple beheading, a supposed mercy that was publicly proclaimed as evidence of his magnanimity, while in reality serving to prevent the gruesome spectacle of hanging and quartering that might have generated unwanted public sympathy for the victims. On May 17, 1536, 5 men died on Tower Hill for their alleged relationships with and Boleyn. Mark Smeaton, the musician whose forced confession had ignited the entire affair, went to his death maintaining his guilt, perhaps from genuine remorse, perhaps from a final desperate attempt to shield others, or perhaps from a mind utterly broken by torture and terror. Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston all steadfastly proclaimed their innocence to the very end, their final words meticulously recorded by observers who understood the profound historical significance of the moment. George Boleyn's execution was perhaps the most poignant of all. As Anne's brother and closest ally, his death represented not merely the loss of a life, but the utter destruction of a family that had soared so high and fallen so catastrophically far. His final speech was noted for its profound dignity and his continued protestations of innocence, delivered with the very eloquence that had once made him a valued member of the king's inner circle. And, confined to her apartments within the Tower, would undoubtedly have heard the chilling sounds of her alleged lover's executions. The crowds gathering, the executioner's axe falling, the roar of approval from spectators eager for blood. The psychological torture of knowing that men had died because of their purported relationships with her, whether those relationships were real or cruelly fabricated, must have been almost unbearable. Meanwhile, Henry had already moved on with characteristic speed and chilling callousness. Even before Anne's own trial began, he was busily making arrangements for his marriage to Jane Seymour, the pale, quiet woman who embodied everything and was not. Where and had been dark, passionate, and intellectually challenging, Jane was fair, submissive, and seemingly content to play the role of the decorative royal wife. Anne's own trial commenced on May 15, 1536, in the Great Hall of the Tower of London. The chosen location was highly significant. By trying and within the tower itself, Henry deftly avoided the potential for public demonstrations in her favor, while ensuring that the proceedings took place under the intimidating shadow of the fortress where she was imprisoned. The trial itself was a master study in Tudor pageantry and legal theater. Anne entered the hall wearing a black gown, the stark color of mourning that served as a visual reminder of her precipitous fall from grace. She was accompanied by her ladies-in-waiting, who had been permitted to remain with her as both a comfort and as silent witnesses, ensuring that her behavior during the proceedings was accurately recorded. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk and Anne's own uncle, presided over the trial as Lord High Steward. The sight of Norfolk pronouncing judgment on his niece was perhaps the most vivid illustration of the brutal realities of Tudor politics, where family loyalty was always brutally subordinate to royal favor and personal survival. The charges against Anne were read in full, each accusation more damning than the last. She was accused of adultery with Henry Norris on October 6, 1533, at Westminster Palace, with William Brereton on November 8, 1533, at Westminster, with Mark Smeaton on April 26, 1536, at Westminster, and with Francis Weston on May 20, 1534, at Westminster Palace. The chilling specificity of the dates and locations was clearly intended to lend credibility to the fabricated charges, though it also inadvertently revealed their manufactured nature. The precision was too perfect, too conveniently tailored for prosecutors who desperately needed to fabricate a case beyond reasonable doubt. The incest charge involving her brother George was dated November 2, 1535, at Westminster Palace, a date that conveniently placed the alleged unspeakable crime well after Anne's last pregnancy had ended in miscarriage. The carefully chosen timing suggested not passionate transgression, but calculated conspiracy, which perfectly served Cromwell's narrative of a queen so utterly depraved that no crime was beneath her. Perhaps the most serious charge was that Anne had conspired to imagine and compass the death of the king, and had promised to marry one of her lovers after Henry's death. This charge of treasonous intent was the most difficult to prove, but also the most crucial. Without it, Anne's other alleged crimes might have been dismissed as mere personal moral failings rather than grave threats to the state that demanded the ultimate penalty. Anne's response to the accusations was meticulously observed and recorded. Contemporary accounts describe her as maintaining remarkable composure throughout the reading of the damning charges, her face a mask of regal dignity that betrayed little of the inner turmoil she must have been experiencing. When given the opportunity to respond, she denied all charges with an impressive firmness that reportedly impressed even her sworn enemies. Her defense was necessarily constrained by the legal limitations of the era. As a woman and a subject, she possessed few rights in the proceedings. She could not call witnesses in her favor, could not cross-examine her accusers, and was not permitted legal counsel. The trial was transparently structured to reach a predetermined conclusion, with and cast in the role of defendant in a proceeding where her guilt was assumed rather than proven. The evidence against Anne consisted primarily of vague testimony from servants and courtiers who claimed to have witnessed suspicious behavior or overheard compromising conversations. Much of this testimony was remarkably vague and circumstantial. A fleeting glance here, a private conversation there, gifts exchanged between the queen and her alleged lovers. The prosecution relied heavily on interpretation and innuendo, constructing a fragile case on a foundation of flimsy court gossip and wild speculation. One particularly damaging piece of testimony came from a Lady Wingfield, who was conveniently deceased by the time of the trial and therefore conveniently unable to be cross-examined. Lady Wingfield had allegedly told others before her death that she possessed knowledge of Anne's misconduct, though the specific nature of this knowledge was never clearly established. The cynical use of testimony from a deceased witness who could not be challenged was a telling indication of the prosecution's desperation to construct even a superficially convincing case. The astonishing speed of the trial proceedings was remarkable, even by ruthless Tudor standards. The entire case was presented, debated, and decided in a single day, a pace that left virtually no time for careful consideration of the flimsy evidence or for and to mount any effective defense. The intense pressure to reach a swift resolution directly reflected Henry's feverish eagerness to proceed with his plans for a new marriage and his desire to minimize any time available for public opinion to organize in Anne's favor. When the moment arrived for the jury to retire and consider their verdict, there was little suspense about the outcome. The 26 peers who sat in judgment included men who owed their very positions to Henry's favor and who perfectly understood that their own futures hinged entirely on delivering the verdict the king desired. Among them were some who had once been Anne's staunch supporters, but who now found themselves in the agonizing position of condemning her to save themselves. The guilty verdict was announced by Norfolk with what observers described as visible emotion. Though whether this reflected genuine sorrow or merely relief at completing an unpleasant, dangerous duty remains historically unclear. As Anne's uncle, Norfolk's position was particularly unenviable. He was forced to participate in the destruction of his own family member while maintaining the chilling fiction that impartial justice was being served. The sentence pronounced upon Anne was death by burning or beheading. At the king's pleasure, the option of burning reflected the traditional medieval punishment for women who committed treason, particularly those guilty of adultery against their husbands. The alternative of beheading was presented as a profound mercy, though it also conveniently served Henry's purposes by avoiding the horrific, potentially sympathy-generating spectacle of a queen being burned alive in full view of the public. Anne's reaction to the sentence was widely noted by all present. She received the news of her condemnation with what contemporary accounts describe as remarkable composure, maintaining the dignity of her royal position even in the face of imminent death. Her immediate response included a prayer that God save the king, and a firm protestation of her innocence that rang through the great hall of the Tower with a clarity that reportedly moved even her enemies. But it was her private moments, meticulously recorded by Sir William Kingston and the loyal ladies who attended her, that revealed the full, crushing weight of what she was enduring in the agonizing days between her trial and execution, and swung wildly between desperate hope and profound despair, defiant confidence and paralyzing terror, revealing the intense psychological torture of her situation. She continued to express unwavering faith that Henry would ultimately show mercy, that their shared history and the love they had once felt for each other would somehow count for something in the final, brutal calculation. This clinging faith appears almost tragic in hindsight, given what is now known of Henry's ruthless character and his callous treatment of other wives who had fallen from favor. Anne's apparent inability to fully accept the horrifying reality of her situation may have been a vital psychological defense mechanism, a desperate way of maintaining sanity in circumstances that would have utterly broken most individuals. The question of Anne's actual guilt or innocence has continued to fascinate historians for nearly 5 centuries. The evidence presented against her was largely circumstantial and based almost entirely on the testimony of individuals whose own survival depended explicitly on pleasing the king. Mark Smeaton's confession, extracted under extreme torture, formed the tenuous cornerstone of the entire case. But confessions obtained through torture were notoriously unreliable, even by brutal Tudor standards. The precise, specific dates and locations cited in the charges against Anne present significant logical problems for those who genuinely believe in her guilt. Court records clearly show that Anne was either pregnant or had recently given birth during many of the times when she was allegedly conducting affairs, making the physical demands of multiple secret relationships extremely difficult, if not outright impossible. Moreover, the intense scrutiny under which royal consorts constantly lived made secret romantic relationships extraordinarily risky and notoriously difficult to conceal. The astonishing speed with which the charges were developed and the subsequent trials conducted strongly suggests a predetermined outcome rather than a careful, impartial investigation of actual wrongdoing. Cromwell's chilling efficiency in constructing the case against Anne and her alleged co-conspirators was remarkable, but it also raises profound questions about whether the evidence was genuinely discovered or cynically manufactured. Perhaps most tellingly, none of Anne's alleged lovers, with the singular exception of the tortured Smeaton, ever confessed to their fabricated crimes, even when offered the tantalizing possibility of commuted sentences. Men facing certain death would have had every conceivable incentive to admit their guilt if it might have saved their lives. Yet they chose to steadfastly maintain their innocence to the very end. The political context of Anne's catastrophic fall also strongly supports the argument for her innocence. By 1536, Henry was desperately yearning for a male heir and had already begun his relentless pursuit of Jane Seymour. Anne's tragic miscarriage in January of that year had effectively rendered her useless to the king, transforming her from a prized asset to be protected into a mere obstacle to his plans for a new marriage. Henry's character, as vividly revealed through his ruthless treatment of other wives and political opponents, strongly suggests a man fully capable of eliminating anyone who stood in the way of his desires. His willingness to break with the mighty Roman Church to marry and demonstrated his utter ruthlessness in pursuing his goals. His willingness to destroy her when she no longer served his purposes revealed the same calculating cruelty, now applied in reverse. Yet, the question of Anne's guilt extends beyond the specific charges of adultery and treason to larger, more nuanced questions about her inherent behavior and character. Contemporary accounts describe her as undeniably intelligent, fiercely ambitious, and politically astute, but also as sometimes arrogant, sharp-tongued, and vindictive toward those who dared to cross her. Her treatment of Catherine of Aragon and Princess Mary had earned her numerous powerful enemies at court, who were undoubtedly eager to witness her downfall. Anne's sharp tongue and quick wit, which had initially captivated and attracted Henry, may have paradoxically become liabilities as their marriage deteriorated. Her willingness to openly argue with the king and challenge his decisions was highly unusual for a royal consort and may have significantly contributed to Henry's growing resentment of her formidable influence over him. The intensity of Anne's relationship with her brother George also raised eyebrows at court. Though there is no credible evidence whatsoever to support the monstrous incest charges beyond the naturally close emotional bond between siblings who had risen together through the treacherous waters of Tudor politics, their mutual support and obvious affection may have appeared suspiciously intimate to observers actively looking for evidence of wrongdoing. However, it more likely simply reflected the natural, powerful alliance of family members navigating a dangerous, cutthroat world. As, in awaited execution in the Tower, Henry was already making frantic preparations for his next marriage. On May 14th, the day before Anne's trial, Archbishop Cranmer was summoned to Lambeth Palace to hear Henry's confession and to pronounce his marriage to and null and void. The astonishing speed of this proceeding nakedly revealed Henry's eagerness to clear any remaining legal obstacles to his union with Jane Seymour. The annulment of Henry's marriage to and was based on the identical theological arguments that had been previously used to dissolve his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The spurious claim that the union had never been valid in God's eyes. In Anne's case, Henry cited his previous relationship with her sister Mary as a spurious impediment that made their marriage incestuous and therefore invalid from the very beginning. The irony of this argument was truly exquisite. Henry was simultaneously claiming that and was guilty of adultery within their marriage, while also arguing that no legal marriage had ever existed between them. The logical contradiction was far less important to Henry than the legal convenience. By declaring the marriage invalid, Henry could cynically claim that Anne had never truly been queen and that their daughter Elizabeth was, therefore, illegitimate. The psychological impact on and of learning that her marriage was being declared null and void must have been utterly devastating. In a single stroke, Henry was erasing not just their relationship, but her entire identity as Queen of England. She was being reduced from a crowned queen to a mere woman who had lived in sin with the king, her daughter stripped of legitimacy, and her life's work summarily dismissed as meaningless. Meanwhile, the grim preparations for Anne's execution proceeded with the chilling efficiency that characterized all aspects of Tudor administration. Henry had made the unusual and highly significant decision to import a swordsman from Calais rather than use the traditional axe that was employed for most English executions. The choice of a sword over an axe was publicly presented as a mercy. The French method was supposed to be quicker and more reliable than the English approach. The selection of a foreign executioner served several purposes beyond mere efficiency. It subtly distanced Henry from the brutal act itself, allowing him to present Anne's death as a matter of legal necessity rather than personal vengeance. It also eliminated the dangerous possibility that an English executioner might refuse the task or might be influenced by sympathy for the condemned queen. The executioner who arrived from Calais was described as an expert in his grim craft. a man who had performed similar services for the French court, and who brought with him not just skill, but the aura of continental sophistication. His very presence at the tower was a stark reminder that Anne's death was being conducted according to the highest, most refined standards of European practice. The sword itself became an object of morbid fascination and dread during Anne's final days. Unlike the heavy, brutal axe traditionally used for English executions, the imported executioner's sword was described as relatively light and sharply honed, specifically designed for precision rather than brute force. The weapon was kept carefully hidden until the very moment of execution, adding an element of macabre mystery to the proceedings that heightened the psychological tension. Anne's behavior during her final days revealed a woman struggling valiantly to maintain her dignity and sanity under circumstances that would have utterly broken most individuals. Sir William Kingston's reports describe her as sometimes confident and defiantly resolute, other times weeping inconsolably and despairing. She spoke frequently of her unwavering innocence and her steadfast faith that God would ultimately vindicate her. But she also made practical arrangements for her impending death with a chilling clarity that suggested she fully understood the horrifying reality of her situation. One of the most poignant aspects of Anne's final days was her profound concern for her young daughter, Elizabeth. At not yet 3 years old, Elizabeth was too young to comprehend what was happening to her mother, and was acutely aware that her death would leave the child orphaned and tragically stripped of legitimacy. Her desperate requests to see Elizabeth one final time were cruelly denied, adding yet another layer of unbearable cruelty to her final hours. Anne's ladies-in-waiting, who had been permitted to remain with her throughout her agonizing imprisonment, provided both comfort and, implicitly, surveillance during these final days. These women, who had once competed fiercely for the honor of serving the Queen, now found themselves in the impossible, morally compromising position of supporting a woman they knew was doomed, while simultaneously protecting their own precarious positions at court. The night before her execution, Anne spent hours in fervent prayer and quiet reflection, meticulously preparing her soul for what she believed would be her solemn journey to judgment before God. Contemporary accounts describe her as remarkably calm and resigned, having finally accepted that Henry would show no mercy and that her death was utterly inevitable. She also spent time meticulously preparing for the practical aspects of her execution, discussing with her ladies the precise clothing she would wear and the dignified behavior that would be expected of her on the scaffold. Even in death, Anne acutely understood that she would be performing for a vast, scrutinizing audience, and that her final moments would be meticulously examined for any signs of guilt, innocence, repentance, or defiance. The morning of May 19th, 1536, dawned gray and misty, with a dampness in the air that seemed to perfectly reflect the somber, oppressive mood that had settled over the tower. Anne woke early, having slept little during her final night, and immediately began the rituals that would prepare her for her ultimate fate. She chose to wear a dark gray damask gown with a white chemise beneath, colors that profoundly suggested both mourning and purity. The choice was deeply significant. By wearing white, and was making a silent, powerful statement about her innocence, while the gray represented her acceptance of the inevitable death that awaited her. Her hair, which had once been her crowning glory and had initially captivated Henry's attention, was arranged simply and covered with a white coif that would make the executioner's grim task easier. The practical considerations of execution influenced even these final, personal details, serving as a stark reminder to and that she was no longer a woman preparing for a social occasion, but a condemned prisoner preparing for death itself. Anne's final meal was simple, some bread and wine that she consumed more for its solemn ritual significance than from any actual appetite. Food held little appeal for someone facing imminent death, but the act of breaking bread served as a final communion with life and a preparation for whatever lay beyond. As the morning progressed, and could hear the chilling sounds of preparation outside her window. The scaffold had been fully completed during the night, and workmen were now testing its construction and meticulously arranging the straw that would absorb her blood. The practical preparations for death were conducted with the same cold efficiency that characterized all aspects of Tudor administration. The crowd began gathering early, drawn by the unprecedented, macabre spectacle of a queen's execution. While public executions were common entertainment in Tudor England, the death of a crowned queen was extraordinary, utterly unprecedented in English history, and unlikely to be repeated. The Tower Green was rapidly filling with eager spectators, jostling for position to witness this historic, horrifying moment. Among the crowd were courtiers who had once competed fiercely for Anne's favor, merchants who had profited handsomely from her patronage, and common people who had followed her dramatic rise and precipitous fall with the intense fascination that royal drama has always inspired. Some came from idle curiosity, others from a grim sense of historical duty, and still others from the darker human impulse to witness destruction and death. The Constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, arrived at Anne's apartments with the formal, grim notification that her time had come. His demeanor was respectful, but unyieldingly firm. He was there to escort a queen to her death, but also to ensure that a condemned traitor met the fate prescribed by law. Anne's response to Kingston's arrival was noted by all present. She rose from her chair with the profound dignity that had characterized her throughout her imprisonment, straightened her gown, and declared herself ready to meet her fate. Her composure was truly remarkable. She showed no outward signs of the hysteria or breakdown that might have been expected from someone facing imminent execution. The walk from her apartments to the scaffold was perhaps the longest, most agonizing journey of Anne's life. Each measured step took her further from the world of the living and closer to whatever lay beyond death. The route led her through the very same courtyards where she had once walked as queen, past the same formidable buildings where she had exercised royal authority and received the homage of her subjects. The stark contrast between her current dire circumstances and her former glory must have been almost unbearable. The same ancient stones that had once echoed with the eager footsteps of those seeking her favor now witnessed her final, lonely journey to the scaffold. The tower that had been her palace during her coronation preparations was now the grim setting for her brutal destruction. As Anne emerged on a Tower Green, the vast crowd fell into a stunned silence. The sight of a queen walking to her death was so unprecedented, so utterly shocking, that even the most hardened spectators were momentarily rendered speechless. Here stood a woman who had once been the most powerful person in England after the king himself, now reduced to the role of condemned criminal, approaching her final, inevitable moment. The scaffold itself was a simple wooden platform, raised only a few feet above the ground to ensure that the entire crowd could witness the execution clearly. Unlike the high scaffolds used for male traitors, Anne's execution platform was designed for intimacy rather than grand spectacle, reflecting perhaps some vestige of respect for her former exalted position as queen. The executioner was already present on the scaffold, a mysterious, somber figure made so by his black hood and the unfamiliar nature of his foreign garb. He stood motionless beside the low block wherein would kneel, his sword hidden beneath a covering of straw to prevent any premature glimpse of the instrument of death, and mounted the scaffold with steady steps, assisted by her loyal ladies, who had been permitted to accompany her to this final stage of her harrowing journey. Once on the platform, she turned to face the vast, silent crowd, preparing to deliver the customary speech that all condemned traitors were expected to make. Her final words have been preserved in multiple contemporary accounts, though there are slight variations in the exact phrasing. The essence of her speech was a powerful protestation of her unwavering loyalty to the king and her acceptance of the grim judgment that had been passed upon her. She asked for prayers for her soul and expressed her fervent hope that God would show mercy to her in the next world. What is most striking about Anne's final speech is what she deliberately did not say. She did not proclaim her innocence directly, nor did she launch any attack on Henry or the biased court that had condemned her. Whether this remarkable restraint reflected genuine acceptance of her cruel fate shrewd political calculation designed to protect her young daughter Elizabeth, or simply profound physical and emotional exhaustion, remains a matter of intense historical debate. After completing her speech, Anne calmly removed her elaborate headdress and precious jewelry, placing them carefully into the hands of her weeping ladies. The act of removing these powerful symbols of her earthly status was both practical and deeply symbolic. She was stripping away the last vestiges of her identity as queen and preparing to meet death as simply Anne Boleyn. Her ladies then gently blindfolded her with a white cloth, a final mercy that would spare her the horrifying sight of the approaching sword. The blindfold also served the practical purpose of ensuring that Anne would remain perfectly still during the crucial moment when the executioner struck, as any slight movement could tragically transform a quick death into a prolonged, agonizing one. With the blindfold firmly in place, Anne knelt gracefully beside the low block that had been prepared for her execution. Her posture remained erect and dignified, maintaining the regal bearing that had characterized her throughout the entire ordeal. Even in these final, fleeting moments, she remained acutely conscious of the image she was presenting to posterity. The executioner approached with silent, measured steps, his sword now revealed for the first time. The weapon was indeed strikingly different from the traditional, heavy English axe. Longer, thinner, and exquisitely designed for a single, precise stroke that would sever the neck cleanly. The sight of the foreign weapon added an exotic, chilling element to the proceedings, enhancing the sense of witnessing something truly unprecedented in English history. What transpired next will be debated and analyzed for centuries. The executioner raised his sword, and in a movement so blindingly swift that many in the vast crowd missed it entirely, brought the blade down in a single, decisive stroke. Anne Boleyn's head was severed from her body with a devastating precision that spoke volumes about the unparalleled skill of the man Henry had imported from Calais. Contemporary accounts describe the crowd's reaction as one of stunned silence, followed by a mixture of gasps, murmured prayers, and hushed conversations. The horrifying reality of what they had witnessed, the execution of a queen, was so overwhelming that many spectators seemed utterly unable to process what they had just seen. Some instinctively crossed themselves and whispered prayers for Anne's soul, while others simply stared in morbid fascination at the scene before them. The executioner's efficiency was both a profound mercy and a chilling horror. Anne's death was instantaneous, sparing her the prolonged agony that often characterized executions with the traditional axe. But the very speed of her destruction also brutally emphasized the finality of what had occurred. One moment she was a living, breathing woman. The next, she was merely a body on the scaffold. Anne's loyal ladies, who had watched their beloved mistress die with tears streaming down their faces, now performed their final, agonizing service. They carefully gathered Anne's remains, tenderly wrapping her head and body in white cloth with the profound tenderness of women preparing a cherished friend for burial. Their grief was genuine and deeply profound. These women had served faithfully during her meteoric rise to power and had remained fiercely loyal to her even in her darkest, most desperate hour. The crowd began to disperse almost immediately after the execution, as if the spectators were eager to escape the crushing weight of what they had witnessed. The unprecedented nature of the event, the execution of a crowned queen of England, left many feeling that they had participated in something that fundamentally challenged the very foundations of royal authority and divine right. Within hours of Anne's death, King Henry VIII was already moving forward with his relentless plans for the future. He married Jane Seymour in a private ceremony on May 30th, 1536, just 11 days after Anne's execution. The astonishing speed of this transition starkly revealed Henry's eagerness to put the entire traumatic episode behind him and begin anew with a wife who promised to be more compliant and less challenging than her predecessor. But Henry's desperate attempt to erase Anne from history was not entirely successful. Her daughter, Elizabeth, though declared illegitimate, miraculously survived and would eventually ascend to become one of England's greatest monarchs. The very woman Henry had brutally destroyed in his relentless pursuit of a male heir would be powerfully remembered through the daughter, whose legitimacy he had so cruelly denied. The men who had tragically died alongside and were quickly forgotten by history, their names remembered primarily only in connection with her story. Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and George Boleyn had all been mercilessly sacrificed to Henry's insatiable need for a clean, unambiguous break from his second marriage. Their deaths served as a terrifying warning to anyone who might dare to challenge royal authority or become too closely associated with a fallen favorite. Thomas Cromwell, who had so meticulously orchestrated the entire affair, continued to serve Henry faithfully until his own dramatic fall from grace and execution in 1540. His ultimate fate served as a chilling reminder that in Henry's treacherous court, even the most valuable and loyal servants were expendable when they no longer served the king's capricious purposes. The haunting question of Anne's actual guilt or innocence continued to torment those who had participated in her destruction. Some, like Thomas Cranmer, would later express private doubts about the true justice of her execution. Others, like the Duke of Norfolk, would publicly maintain their support for the verdict, while perhaps harboring deep private reservations about their own chilling role in condemning a family member. The broader implications of Anne's execution extended far beyond the immediate political consequences. Her death established a terrifying precedent that would profoundly influence Henry's treatment of his subsequent wives and would contribute significantly to the pervasive climate of fear and uncertainty that characterized the latter part of his tyrannical reign. The king, who had once been seen as a cultured Renaissance prince, relatively moderate and enlightened, was now starkly revealed as a ruthless ruler capable of extraordinary brutality in pursuit of his desires. The international reaction to Anne's execution was one of widespread shock and universal condemnation. European courts, already horrified by Henry's dramatic break with Rome, now viewed him as a dangerous, unpredictable tyrant who had murdered his own wife to satisfy his insatiable lust for another woman. The execution severely damaged England's reputation abroad and further isolated the country from Catholic Europe. Yet, for all the complex political calculations and dire international consequences, the human cost of Anne's destruction remained the most significant and heartbreaking aspect of the entire affair. A woman who had once been the most powerful person in England after the king himself had been reduced to a headless corpse on a scaffold, her vibrant life sacrificed to her husband's ruthless ambitions and deep-seated insecurities. The Tower of London, which had borne silent witness to Anne's execution, would continue to serve as the grim stage for royal dramas and political executions for centuries to come. But the haunting memory of that gray morning in May 1536 would forever linger within the ancient stones of the fortress, a chilling reminder of the steep price of royal favor and the profound dangers of standing too close to absolute power. Anne's burial was as hurried and undignified as her trial had been. Her remains were placed in an old elm chest that had once contained bow staves, and she was interred without ceremony in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower grounds. No elaborate funeral, no royal ceremony, no grand monument to mark the resting place of a woman who had once been Queen of England. The very location of Anne's burial was fitting in its cruel irony. She was laid to rest in the same humble chapel where many other victims of royal injustice had been interred, including her own brother, George, and the men who had died as her alleged lovers. The chapel thus became a silent, somber gathering place for those who had fallen from Henry's favor, a permanent, tragic testimony to the deadly consequences of proximity to unchecked power. In the days immediately following Anne's execution, life at court resumed with a callous normalcy that was almost obscene in its indifference. Courtiers who had once fiercely competed for Anne's attention now swiftly redirected their energies to ingratiating themselves with Jane Seymour. The intricate machinery of royal government continued to function as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, as if the execution of a queen was merely another administrative task completed with typical Tudor efficiency. Yet, Beneath the veneer of normalcy, the profound trauma of Anne's destruction continued to reverberate deeply throughout the court. Those who had witnessed her execution carried with them the indelible memory of that swift, decisive stroke that had ended a life and irrevocably changed the course of English history. The haunting image of a blindfolded queen kneeling beside a block, maintaining her dignity even in the face of death, would forever haunt those who had been present for the rest of their lives. The psychological impact on Henry himself remains a subject of intense historical speculation. Contemporary accounts suggest that he showed no outward signs of remorse or regret, instead throwing himself into his new marriage with apparent, almost feverish enthusiasm. Yet, the astonishing speed with which he moved to erase and from official records and public memory strongly suggests a man desperate to escape the crushing weight of what he had done. Official portraits of and were removed from royal residences. Her initials were brutally carved away from buildings where they had been proudly displayed, and her coat of arms was swiftly replaced with those of Jane Seymour. The systematic erasure of Anne's presence from the physical landscape of royal power was thorough and chillingly deliberate, as if Henry genuinely believed that by removing all physical traces of her existence, he could somehow undo the horrifying reality of what had occurred. But history, as it often does, has a way of preserving what rulers desperately seek to destroy. Anne's powerful story survived not just in official records, but in the enduring memories of those who had known her, in the whispered conversations of courtiers who had witnessed her dramatic rise and tragic fall, and in the growing legend of a woman who had dared to challenge the established order and had paid the ultimate, unimaginable price for her audacity. The execution of Boleyn marked a profound turning point in Henry VIII's tumultuous reign and in English history more broadly. It starkly demonstrated the terrifying extent to which royal power could be wielded to destroy even those closest to the throne, and it established chilling precedents that would profoundly influence the treatment of subsequent queens and political opponents. The woman who had once been powerful enough to dramatically change the religious direction of an entire nation had been reduced to a mere cautionary tale about the perils of overreaching ambition and the treacherous fickleness of royal favor. As the sun set on May 19, 1536, the Tower of London settled into an uneasy, profound quiet. The scaffold had been meticulously dismantled, the morbid crowd had long dispersed, and the physical evidence of Anne's execution had been cleared away. But the immense psychological and political consequences of what had occurred that morning would continue to shape English history for generations to come. The woman who had woken that morning to the chilling sound of steel being sharpened was now finally at peace. Her struggles with Henry and the hostile court mercifully ended. The blade that had been prepared with such meticulous care and brutal precision had performed its function with deadly efficiency, silencing forever a voice that had once commanded the attention of kings and irrevocably changed the course of nations. In the deepening darkness of that May evening, as the Tower guards made their rounds and the Thames' murky waters gently lapped against the fortress walls, the haunting ghost of Boleyn began its long, enduring haunting of English history. The woman who had been so systematically erased from official memory would powerfully live on in the poignant stories told by those who remembered her, in the lingering questions raised by historians who doubted her guilt, and in the enduring legend of a queen who had dared to challenge a king and had paid for that audacious challenge with her very life. The ominous sound of steel being sharpened had announced the beginning of Anne's final day. The profound silence that followed her execution marked the brutal end of one of the most dramatic and tragic chapters in the long, blood-soaked history of the English crown. In that silence, pregnant with the crushing weight of what had been lost and what had been utterly destroyed, the true, agonizing horror of Boleyn's execution finally revealed itself. Not just the death of a woman, but the murder of possibilities, the destruction of a different future, and the ultimate triumph of fear over hope in the treacherous, unforgiving world of Tudor England.